see either they're slightly different from what they are, or when we talk, we see things are not normal.
Welcome to Strange Familiars. If you have a story of an encounter with the paranormal you'd like to share with us, you can email us, strangefamiliarspodcast@gmail.com. Snow is coming down.
I'm hoping that will act as a natural sort of
sound
barrier.
Yeah, that would be nice.
So when the trucks go by with their Jake brakes at twice the speed they should, maybe it won't be so loud.
So this is an episode I've been wanting to do for a while. At least since the Spindrift episode. Because Barbara contacted us. A few people contacted us in the past about the story of the Shadow's ghost, right? Mm-hmm. The ghost of the shadow, however you want to phrase it. But most recently, Barbara did. And she's like, his house was only a walk away from the Spindrift house. And
the author of the Shadow.
The author of the Shadow, where he was staying. And much has been made, which we will hear, of people seeing the Shadow's ghost in the house in which he used to live. But he had some other encounters with the paranormal too, which I've never heard anybody else talk about. So we're going to talk about them tonight, along with the Shadow. Before we get to that, I just want to remind everybody that we cannot do Strange Familiars without our patrons. So if you like what we do, if you like the content we make and you want to help us, please consider becoming a patron at Patreon. It's patreon.com/strangefamiliars. You can check out all the different levels of support there. Any level helps. There's monthly subscription options and there's yearly subscription options. They all help. Go ahead, check it out. Patreon.com/strangefamiliars. This month's patron episode is going to be related, in a way, to this episode. We'll get to a little bit more about that later. If you don't like the idea of a monthly or yearly subscription like Patreon and you still want to help, go to the show notes under any episode at strangefamiliars.com. Look for the paypal.me link. You can click on that and make a one-time donation. And of course, everyone can help by sharing the show on social media, liking and subscribing wherever you're listening, whether it's a podcatcher, one of the many, many podcatchers out there, or YouTube, or wherever you're listening, and by leaving us those nice 5-star reviews, which, believe it or not, helps get the show in front of new potential listeners. And of course, while we're talking about patrons, I want to thank our patrons, as we do every episode, because no patrons, no Strange Familiars. We just couldn't do it without them. We got your January patron show coming up soon. Thanks, everybody. So let's get back to this episode on Walter Gibson, sort of the creator of the Shadow.
Is that his real name? I just assume that all comic book people have like a pretend name.
Well, Walter Gibson was the author's real name, but he wrote under the name of Maxwell Grant. He wrote the Shadow stories.
Oh, see?
Yeah.
I guessed correctly. I didn't actually know.
Yeah.
Maxwell Grant does sound like a honestly, it sounds like kind of a third-rate magician name, but
well, we're going to get into that.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I actually don't have a good working knowledge of this.
Yeah.
So this is all purely just
hang tight. You're going to like this guy.
Okay. Sci-fi tropes.
So much of this information comes from two sources. It comes from Duende number 2, which is a Shadow fanzine that was published in 1976. I have in my notes 1876. That's obviously a typo.
I would love to collect zines from 1876, right? Though, if anybody had a Xerox machine then.
And it comes from the Shadow Scrapbook by Walter Gibson. And there's a couple other sources throughout, like the Mothman prophecies and stuff. The Shadow.
There's a connection to the Mothman prophecies?
Oh, yeah.
Is there anything John Keel didn't have his hands on?
I don't believe so. Not in the paranormal, no. The Shadow Scrapbook was a book that Walter Gibson wrote later in his life, I think in the 70s. That was sort of a remembrance of the Shadow and has a lot of the different stories about writing it, his recollections about writing it, but also it's like a checklist for all the different Shadow magazines and comics and stuff that were made up into that time.
Oh,
so it's really neat source.
Complete discography.
Yeah. So Walter Gibson himself was a super interesting man. He was very interested in stage magic.
Hence the name Maxwell Grant. That sounds like a stage magician name.
He was friends with Houdini.
That I think I did know.
Yeah, he was good friends with Houdini. He actually hosted the annual Houdini seance, the one that they would try to contact Houdini every year.
Mm-hmm.
Was it on his date of death or his birthday? Do you remember?
I want to say it was his death.
I think it was. I think so.
I'm getting that and the Poe birthday thing confused.
Right, yeah. But Gibson actually hosted the seance for several years.
And then he passed it on to the people that own the Houdini Museum in
I think
Scranton,
so, yeah.
which is on our list as soon as COVID's over. I want to go to Scranton.
And he actually did some ghostwriting for Houdini. He wrote a couple Houdini books.
Oh, wow.
And he did ghostwriting for another magician you may know, Blackstone, another famous stage magician.
Wow. The first iteration of Blackstone.
I think so. He did ghostwriting for another author by the name of Professor A.F. Seward, and he claimed to be the world's leading astrologer. So Gibson, before he was ever into the shadow, he was already into stage magic, he was into psychic phenomena, he was into like weird stories and what we would call now Forteana. He was into all that stuff.
Well, what did he do? Was he just a writer of like short stories or something for magazines?
He wrote for magazines, anything that paid, pretty much. He wrote, like I said, he did this ghostwriting. He wrote books about on magic, on crime, on dreams, and even Pinochle. He wrote books about the card game Pinochle.
Oh,
so he
wow.
just, anything that he could, he wrote about. He was very super prolific. He sometimes wrote 2 full shadow novels in a month.
Wow.
Yeah.
Some people might call that sort of like hack writing, if you can pump out 2 novels in a month. Other people think maybe meth.
This was pre-meth, I think. There are stories of him typing till his fingers were bloody, literally, on the typewriter. There was eventually a Shadow Pulp magazine. Now, the Shadow started as a character that was kind of a host of a radio show. And people became so interested in who the Shadow was. It was kind of almost like the Crypt Keeper, you know?
Mm-hmm.
People became so interested in who the Shadow was that they decided to make the Shadow into this character. And then Gibson took that and he kind of developed this whole character based on the idea.
Like the first time that the Shadow appears, he's not a comic book hero.
He's not really fleshed out. No, he's just this sort of narrator, kind of introduces these crime tales. It's a magazine called Detective Story Magazine, and we'll get into this a little bit more when we talk to Jon. And they had a radio show called Detective Story Hour. And the Shadow was sort of the host of that and became so popular, kind of, they thought, well, we have to make a character up of the Shadow.
And just because I'm a little off on the chronology here, like what era are we talking about right now?
I think we're talking about like 1930. So.
Oh, okay, pre-World War II.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so when, I mean, maybe you guys discussed this in your comic book version of this, but when does the sort of comic book superhero boom start?
We do talk about that, and the Shadow was sort of a return to these heroic characters because the pulp magazines for almost 20 years had been focused on crime and these kind of stories. Every now and then you get an adventure story, but it really wasn't a character driven adventure story. It might have been like one guy's story about being in Antarctica or something, or climbing Mount Everest or whatever it was. But the Shadow it's this proto-superhero that marks the return of this heroic fiction in these magazines. It's a very important character as far as that goes.
And how often do these things sort of mirror what's happening historically? Like, is the Shadow an allusion to something that happened during World War I that's still sort of following the United States? And
I mean, a lot of the Shadow's villains there was a big interest in Chinese culture at the time, so he has a lot of these sort of, Chinese Mandarin kind of opium den kind of, dealings where he deals with the underground, the Chinese underground and stuff, underworld. And I guess this might be any time in America up until whatever, the sort of fear of the other, I think, fear of the unknown.
And we're also well into the Depression at this point. And so how do comic books as a general rule fare during this time period? Is there a return to this sort of like inexpensive form of entertainment, or is it seen as a luxury?
Pulp magazines and comics were always, that's why they were pulp magazines. They were cheap, they were produced cheaply, and they were meant to be cheap entertainment. So the idea was to sell a lot of them for a little bit of money.
Yeah, so like the dime shows.
Yeah, absolutely. So he was so prolific that sometimes the entire Shadow magazine every month would be written by him under a bunch of different pseudonyms.
Oh, wow.
Like Gibson, we're back to
taking
talking about
control of your
Gibson. Yeah.
your character.
So he started writing under other pseudonyms, so it wouldn't seem just like one guy is writing this magazine. So at one point, Gibson, using the pseudonym Maxwell Grant, which he used for The Shadow, he was the world record holder for typing 1,444,000 words in less than 10 months.
That is impressive.
Yeah. So there were competitors that were analyzing The Shadow magazine because why is it so popular and how can we make a character like this? And they concluded that there must be 3 people writing the magazine due to the output. At one point, it was 2 times a month this magazine was published. And with some months, it was all Gibson. And they figured it can't be one guy. It has to be 3 different writers writing this.
Wow.
And sometimes it was all him. So he's quite the character and quite a prolific writer for sure. He wrote 117 books besides the Shadow books, of which he wrote 282 Shadow novels.
You must be working on like 5 or 6 at the same time just to try to get it.
He definitely, and he worked ahead and...
A little bit.
Yeah, he tried to just get as much done as he could, and once it was successful, he felt like he needed to keep building on that and was really dedicated to the character in a way. But eventually did hand off the writing to some other people. He kept writing it, but other people wrote it too.
And not to bring this back to sort of like a very obvious sort of Jungian thing, but is this supposed to be sort of the shadow side of Walter Gibson?
Interesting. I would say probably not specifically because the character existed before him. I think he kind of tried to build this mysterious character, like what would the shadow be? And he had some ideas, but I don't think it was specifically supposed to be that. But it may be the shadow of all of us in a sense. So all these books, all these different things he wrote, and he did come up with other characters and stuff, but by far his most popular was the Shadow. And we're going to talk with Jon and Sam from Riverbend Comics a little bit about the character of the Shadow. All right, I'd like to welcome Jon and Sam from my favorite comic shop, Riverbend Comics. How you guys doing?
Doing well. How you doing, Tim?
I'm doing all right. And we're going to do a Shadow giveaway, but we'll talk about that at the end of our little chat here. So, the Shadow. He started out not in comics.
Radio.
I think I think the character itself was written because of the popularity of this host character.
Yeah, Detective Story Hour. So that was July 31st, 1930. The radio show was basically like a glorified commercial to help sell copies of the magazine, the companion magazine, Detective Story magazine. And so they created this narrator to entice the listeners along, and it got to the point where the listeners were actually asking at the newsstands for the Shadow Detective magazine because they were sort of making that name synonymous with the whole show. So
yeah, it would have been like if the Crypt Keeper from Tales from the Crypt got more popular than the stories.
Yeah, it was exactly like that. It was totally the same thing. Yeah, they Street and Smith was the company that was publishing the magazine, and they hired this guy Walter Gibson to create a concept that would fit the name and the voice, and then they went ahead with that and published the Shadow magazine starting in April of the next year.
The Shadow character, was extremely popular, but the popularity extended beyond the radio, and it went into books and magazines, and it had a revival, I think, in the 60s.
Yeah, Archie Comics published... Well, it's kind of weird. Archie Comics brought it back in the 60s from 64 to 65. They did 8 issues, and it was part of their sort of Archie superhero line that they were doing.
Oh, I didn't even know about this.
Yeah. So it was really weird because in the first issue, it was classic Shadow, the black cloak, the hat and everything. And in the second issue on, they tried to shift him into more of a conventional superhero with like a superhero costume. And it didn't work, and it crashed after like 8 issues, and they canceled it.
Wow. See, I didn't even know that. I thought the first comics were those early 70s ones from DC, I guess.
Well, the very first comics was the Shadow Comics, which Street and Smith, the same publisher of the Pulp magazine, started publishing in 1940. And there was also a syndicated comic strip from 1940 to 42.
Okay, I remember. I have copies of the syndicated strip, but I didn't know about that earlier one either. Wow, I'm glad I have my comic shop experts here.
The Shadow Comics from 1940 went to 1949, so it was 101 issues they published, I've never seen any of them in person. They look pretty cool. And actually doing this research, I was poking around eBay thinking I'd pick up a couple just to check them out, and they easily go for $100 a pop or more. So
Wow.
John often makes this mistake. He forgets that we're in the business of selling comic books, and he winds up buying a lot of comic books. I still have to educate him on how the business actually works.
Yeah, it's a lifelong problem I have.
I am cursed with the same problem myself.
Sam is gifted with the ability to be a diehard reader and not a collector. But I have the collector bug, and it's not good at times.
Yeah, it can bite you, that one. So
Yeah.
Wow. Now I need to get at least the first issue of that Archie series.
Yeah, I've been scouting one of those on eBay too, and you can actually get them pretty affordably when they're a little more beat up. So we'll come across one eventually, I'm sure.
Wow. See, now I didn't know this. I thought the first comics, and I swear I read that maybe in the Shadow scrapbook, but maybe I was just skimming for information. Maybe I read it wrong. I thought they said that the first appearance were the DC ones in the early 70s.
No, so Archie did the 60s. Street and Smith did the 40s, maybe the entire decade of 40s. And then, DC came along and published the classic Denny O'Neil Kaluta series in 73. And then took a break from that, I guess, and then brought it back in the late 80s with some pretty cool creators, Sienkiewicz, and I think Chaykin did some. And now so 87, and Marvel did the only thing they've ever published was the graphic novel.
Mm-hmm.
And then 93 to 1995 was Dark Horse Comics did a whole bunch of miniseries. And then not until 2012 did we see Shadow Comics again, when Dynamite picked it up. And they've been publishing various series and miniseries up until the present. I don't know when the last one they did was, but a few years ago.
So the Shadow is this very Batman-like character, which I believe predates Batman, right?
Yeah, it predates Batman by a decade. And it's so obvious digging into this that when Batman was created, it was highly influenced from the Shadow, even to the point where he hides in the shadows, and his alter ego is this wealthy playboy rich guy. And even to the point where the Shadow had multiple identities that he would use in his daily life. So his real identity was apparently this guy named Kent Allard, who was an aviator that fought for the French in World War I, and after the war wanted to continue his war against evil. So he developed this identity of the Shadow. And then apparently somehow came into contact with this guy, Lamont Cranston, who was a real, not real in our life, but real person in the Shadow's world, where when the rich playboy was traveling, he would allow the Shadow to take on his identity, and they would sort of swap identities. He had other identities that he would assume from time to time, a businessman named Henry Arnauld. There was an elderly guy he would assume the identity of. He would play the part of a criminologist at times, and then he even showed up as an old janitor named Fritz, who would clean the police station, and that's how he would listen in and hear tips on crimes and sneak into the evidence cabinet and things like that. So just like Batman has his various identities, it's so similar.
I didn't know. See, my Batman mythos must not be as deep as I thought. I knew that about Moon Knight, who was sort of Marvel's Batman, who has all these different alter egos.
Yeah.
But I didn't know Batman had those different street level personalities he would take on.
Yeah, there's a character named Matches Malone, who is like a seedy underground scumbag guy that would hang out in all the filthy bars, and that's Batman in his Matches Malone disguise. And Batman has been kind of known to be a sort of a master of disguise that would put on various identities to sneak around and stuff. He doesn't do it that often, but the Matches Malone character he's done on a regular basis, and even in the classic 90s Batman cartoon show, he would show up as Matches Malone.
So before the Shadow Pulp magazines, which were really, that and the radio show kind of propelled the Shadow into pop culture fame, I read that the sort of hero in the pulps, the sort of superhero or these proto-superheroes, had really kind of faded. And it was just kind of true crime stuff, or they called it true crime. A lot of it was fictionalized crime that they were publishing, but they specifically brought the Shadow back, they said, to kind of bring the hero back into it. And he really was this kind of proto-superhero.
Yeah, cops and robber comics were really big back then. Dick Tracy was huge. And Dick Tracy had his sort of rogues gallery of weird criminals that sort of were like supervillains.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there really wasn't any kind of like quote unquote superhero being published at the time.
Yeah, really kind of changed the landscape. Now, the Shadow character, they're never like super clear on what his set of powers are.
Yeah,
clouds men's minds. Sorry. Did I say that?
You just say it out loud. He does. You clouded my mind, Sam.
I'm sorry. Well, maybe I'm the Shadow.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of different changes in his powers as it came and gone, and it's kind of funny too. Like part of his origin story is depending on which series you're reading or listening to. What he crashed somewhere, he had a plane crash, and they healed him, and he went to some mountain like mystical city where they taught him these mystical powers to turn invisible and the powers of hypnosis.
Yeah, depending on which history either he was in China or India where he learned those things.
Yeah, and that which is funny because that makes me think of I don't know if you're familiar with the Iron Fist story, which is basically the same origin story as Iron Fist. He was a rich guy who crashed in the mountains and went to the mystical city of Kunlun and trained to learn all his powers.
Yeah, and not that different from Doctor Strange either.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Well, it's funny. I was listening to this and thinking, Sam and I have been checking out, and Sam a lot more than I have been listening to a lot on the hero's journey with I lost the name. Sam, help me out.
Joseph Campbell.
Yeah. Yes. So I was wondering how much of that ties in here, and seems to follow the same pattern. For the one radio show, they had him turning invisible, and I guess the idea was that the criminals couldn't see him, but he was invisible, and yet his shadow wasn't, so they could see his shadow.
Oh, creepy.
Yeah.
Well, the way I became familiar with him was from the 1970s comics because Mike Kaluta, who was one of my favorite artists of all time, was responsible at least for a good portion of those comics, I know.
Yeah.
Do you know how many issues that series ran for?
I think it ran for 12 or 13 issues.
So it wasn't a hugely popular or long-running series.
No.
Huh. And yet this character lodged in people's memories. I remember my dad, when I was just a little kid, just out of nowhere would say, like, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men.
Yeah, I remember my own dad saying that too.
Mine too.
Really?
That's amazing.
Okay, it was a dad thing.
Out of nowhere.
Yeah. Wow, so it's a dad thing.
It's a dad thing.
And that like stuck in my head too, and in fact, when this whole thing came up, I was like, John mentioned the Shadow, and my knowledge of the Shadow was very limited, except that catchphrase lodged in my head, and it's kind of gone through my thinking every now and again for no reason. It comes out of nowhere, and it's like this one thing that I know it's attached to the Shadow. It like was part of my childhood, even though it really wasn't.
Yeah. I think that's the way this character, in a way, kind of, it's in the shadows of pop culture. It's always there.
Yeah.
And it just kind of creeps out in different ways. I think maybe the influence of the character has been greater than the character itself, because certainly more people know Batman and maybe in this day and age even Moon Knight more than the Shadow.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I was thinking about this, and as I was compiling this list of all the comics that have been published, I've been voraciously reading and collecting comics since I was 8 years old, and I never really dived into the Shadow. And so I was sort of surprised to see that really since 1940, there's been Shadow comics with the entire time, except for a few gaps. And so the character himself has been sort of on like the periphery of the comics world, which is a lot like the character itself.
Yeah. It's really, really interesting. Really interesting. Are there Shadow comics being published currently?
Not currently. I was going to look that up. The Dynamite, as far as I know, still has the license to publish them, but they don't have a current comic coming out right now. So,
yeah, I know a few years back they did a Batman Shadow crossover series.
Yeah, and actually reading through all of this, I kind of want to pick that up and read that now that I know how similar they are and how influenced Batman was from the Shadow. But I think that came out probably 3 or 4 years ago, so that's the most recent.
Yeah, I remember the artwork being pretty good. I remember, how picky I am about art.
Yeah.
I remember liking the art. So we have this character that has sort of like haunted pop culture, for lack of a better word, over the years, and still remains. And just for our listeners, we're going to do a special Shadow giveaway with Riverbend Comics. What are we doing? How many of these are we giving away?
I think we're going to give 2 away.
Nice.
How's that sound?
That sounds
like
great.
a good number. So we're the 2 that I have earmarked to give away is funny because one of them I don't have in my hands and I don't remember what it's called. It's the graphic novel that Kaluta did with Russ Heath, the one that you just picked up, Tim.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Mm-hmm. The Hitler's Astrologer, I believe.
Yeah, thank you. Hitler's Astrologer, which was originally published by Marvel in 1988, and Dynamite has reprinted it. And then the other one series that Dynamite's been publishing is the Shadow Master series. And so I figured we'd start somebody off with the first volume of that, which is...
I'm reading it right now.
That's the one you're reading? That's awesome. Illustrated by the great Bill Sienkiewicz.
Yes, you got me this collection not too long ago, and it is fantastic artwork. I mean, the artwork is just stunning.
Yeah, so we're gonna give those away.
I would describe the artwork as like it leaves you feeling eerie even if there's nothing bad happening on the page. People are just sitting around looking at each other, but the colors are so dystopian, and the features on people's faces are so overt and so frightening and Halloween-esque that like you can't turn the page without feeling like a little bit tingled down your spine.
Yeah. Sienkiewicz was at the top of his game at that point. He really was. I mean, it was just incredible stuff. Like really expressive. And was this before or after he had come off of New Mutants? Do you know, John?
This would have been after. This is after New Mutants.
Okay.
Yeah.
If anybody's familiar with like the Legion TV series, that was kind of based on this weird run that he'd done on the comic New Mutants. I guess he'd come off of that, and then I forget when he did Elektra Assassin too. That's another kind of amazing one.
Yeah, around that same time. This would also be after he came off of Moon Knight, which you mentioned earlier as being highly influenced by the Shadow as well. And if folks aren't familiar with the Moon Knight, they will be very soon as it enters the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yeah, that was always one of my favorite characters too. There's been a couple like really, really cool runs on that by different artists and writers. And I didn't realize, and I mean, other than the sort of, Moon Knight to Batman to Shadow connection, I didn't realize with like all those kind of street level personalities how influenced Moon Knight was by the Shadow as well. So it just makes me like both characters more. Yeah,
well, one of Moon Knight's identities is a cab driver, and one of the Shadow's main accomplices was a cab driver.
Right.
So we pulled straight from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Very cool. So the Hitler's Astrologer collection, is that hardcover?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. It's hardback, and the Master Series Volume 1 is a paperback.
Awesome. Well, let's figure out how we want to do this giveaway. I guess we should have talked about that before I hit record. I think we'd mentioned Instagram.
So here's my idea, and if we don't like it, you can erase
this. This is the first time I'm hearing it too, as your partner in business. So
as my business partner, yeah, we're slinging this thing. This actually came to me a little bit ago, and I ran it by my family while we were eating some dinner, and they seemed to think it was a good idea.
Okay.
So my idea for who's going to get these 2 books, it's going to be a random drawing, but how we're going to select those 2 people are, in order to be eligible,
by telepathy.
by clouding our minds with your name. I want to see folks take really creepy, interesting photos of their shadow, post them on Instagram, and tag Strange Familiars and at Riverbend Comics.
Okay, so it's at Strange Familiars and then at Riverbend Comics.
Yeah,
take a photo. Yeah, that's a great idea. So,
what do you think, Sam? Does that sound like a good idea?
I think it's brilliant. I think it fits the genre. I think it fits the mood.
We'll set a deadline based on when this hits the airs. I don't know when
so it should be Thursdays. Okay, so we'll run this until February 11th. Hop on Instagram, tag us with your best, creepiest photo of your shadow, or it could be someone else's shadow, right?
It's a great shadow photo.
Yeah, and please follow at Riverbend Comics and at Strange Familiars at the same time, and we'll pick our favorites. 2 people will get either of these 2 collections.
Exactly. Yep.
How metaphorical are we thinking about these shadow images? Like how abstract or how concrete are we looking for here?
I would invite people to interpret it as they see fit.
Yeah, get creative. Sure.
Yeah.
And then we'll have a powwow, and amongst the 3 of us, we'll choose our 2 favorites.
Yep. Okay. I like that.
All right, awesome. That is an awesome thing. So I own both of these collections, separate from this. I already own them. Each one is a fantastic collection, worth owning, and a really cool place to start a shadow collection, or if you already have one, to add to your collection.
And if folks either don't decide to enter the contest or aren't fortunate enough to win, we do have them stocked at riverbendcomics.com, so you can go in there and get started with some shadow reading.
And you can order anything that's in print for people, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So if we get a great response from this and we sell out of what we have in stock, we can always order more. Just get in touch with us, and happy to do special orders.
Perfect. Jon and Sam, thank you very much. Riverbend Comics, my favorite comic shop, and not just because you carry my books.
Yeah, we have the full line of the Tim Renner collection, so pick up some of those while you're there.
Yeah, you can get Shadow and my books at the same time.
Yeah.
riverbendcomics.com, and where else can they find you?
We are on Instagram at riverbendcomics.com, also on Facebook.
Awesome. I will put links in the notes so people can find you. Make sure to enter that contest, everybody. I'm excited to see these photos. Jon, Sam, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
All right, so like we said before, Gibson lived in New York City in Greenwich Village, about a 10-minute walk from the Spindrift House, if you caught our episode on Spindrift. If you remember, at the Spindrift House, they were seeing like shadowy cloaked figures sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. While we want to talk about the shadow and the shadow's ghost in this episode, I think it's really important to note Gibson did report on other psychic phenomena. In the Duende zine, Gibson reports various occurrences that happened while he was writing The Shadow, including precognitive events. He said he once wrote a story about a deputy sheriff in Maine who was involved in some sort of criminal pursuit, and it turned out there was a very similar real-life case happening in Maine at the same time. It turned out to be true. He said he kept a list of these strange occurrences. Unfortunately, didn't have it with him for the Duende interview because that would have been really interesting. In that, their interest, they're like a shadow fanzine. They're not really interested in the paranormal stuff. You could tell in the interview, Gibson was more interested in talking about that aspect of it than the interviewer.
They just wanted like just kind of pure comic book.
Yeah, they wanted to know about the shadow and all these different things about him, and he was talking about all this other stuff. He posits the idea that is very prescient, ironically, that time may not work exactly as we think, and that we may be moving back and forth through time in a different way than we actually think, which is very Strange Familiars.
Yeah, and then did that sort of inform the Shadow's arc? Does he move back and forward in time within the...
I'm only familiar, honestly, with the comics and a few. I've read one or two of the stories that have been reprinted elsewhere.
You didn't read 278 novels as preparation for this?
I did not, and I listened to some of the radio shows.
Uh-huh.
There's definitely, especially with the radio shows, there's definitely a certain formula to them, I think.
And they probably fit in nicely with other radio plays at the same time.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah. He also talks about a kind of deja vu. He says after he was writing a story set in San Francisco in which he described this thick fog rolling in through the Golden Gate and then enveloping Alcatraz. It was sort of a prison escape story or something. Mm-hmm. He was later visiting San Francisco and he witnessed this same thing happen. He said it was exactly as he had described it in the story. Now, I know for us from here, it's like big deal, some fog rolled in. But I'm thinking for him, it was worth noting. It was weird enough where he was like, whoa, this is like just like
yeah, and he
my
wouldn't
story.
have had the chance to watch something like that on TV or big screen probably.
Oh, yeah.
He wouldn't have had any real life experience with that.
So this part is my favorite little bit of information about Walter Gibson that I found. He hosted a radio show in the 1950s called Strange.
Did he now?
And it had to do with psychic occurrences.
Wow, he's your time traveling doppelganger.
Right? And here we are doing a show called Strange Familiars about Walter Gibson all these years later.
Traveling through time.
One of the stories he relates in that Duende magazine has to do with what our Patreon episode will be this month. He tells a story about researching the death of an English actor named William Terrace. Now, Terrace had an understudy who dreamed he would be stabbed. The dream came true. And we'll tell that whole story on the Patreon episode. So if you're a patron, you'll get to hear that. But as regards Gibson, Gibson went to a party later that night, so he finds this information. He's constantly looking for stories to present on his radio show, Strange, and he does.
Like, what's next week's episode going to
Yeah,
be?
it sounds
That
familiar,
same
right?
panic you have on Sunday.
Sounds a little familiar. And he's doing all this research, and he's going through this thing, and he comes across this story on William Terrace. Later that day, he decides to go to a party. Now, he said it was really unusual because this party was far away. It was quite a drive. It was a hot summer day. He didn't really want to do it, but he and his wife had been promising these friends, okay, we'll come out to the country where he lived. So they finally did. And lo and behold, at that party that night, he meets William Terrace's son, Tommy Terrace, the same night after he had researched that story. Speaking of Tommy Terrace, if you listen to the Patreon episode, we got a little bit on Tommy Terrace too. A little something neat for that. You know, all of our talk of the shadow, I forgot to mention earlier that Orson Welles was the voice of the shadow for a while on the radio show.
I feel like Orson Welles is sort of like, who is it? You say Lafayette shows up in a lot of things. I think Orson Welles is sort of like a pivot towards a lot of unusual phenomenon. He figures largely in a lot of just strangeness.
Yeah, it's an interesting man for sure. Now we get to the story of the Shadow's ghost, though. Supposedly, the Shadow's ghost haunts the house at 12 Gay Street, Greenwich Village, New York. As I said, it's about a 10-minute walk from the Spindrift house. So you'll remember this other character from our Spindrift episode, famous ghost hunter Hans Holzer. He investigated this house, 12 Gay Street, in the early 1960s. This would have been after the time that Walter Gibson lived there. In his book, Yankee Ghosts, he discusses the story. I think it's called The Gay Street Ghost or something, The Ghost of Gay Street. It's reprinted in a more recent volume called Ghosts, True Encounters with the World Beyond. If you're interested, you can check them out. When he gives his history of the house, he fails to mention that Walter Gibson lived there. I don't think he knew. I don't think records were as easily accessible then as they are now.
So there was some kind of paranormal activity around this house, and people didn't know it was the house of the guy that wrote The Shadow?
They didn't mention it in...
Oh, okay.
Hans Holzer didn't mention it at all in his story.
It just had that reputation.
Yeah. So the house was built in the early 1800s, possibly around 1827. According to Holzer, a sculptor lived there in the 1920s. And this sculptor was supposedly fond of alcohol, and he had a special trap door built under which he hid liquor during Prohibition. All of this is certainly within the realm of possibility. Mm-hmm. He claims that the property was later owned by a controversial New York mayor, Jimmy Walker. Not the dynamite guy.
Okay. I don't know which reference is older.
Walker was very controversial, and I think he was drummed out of office, I believe. But supposedly, according to Holzer, this house was used as a home for one of his mistresses. But in 1956, the house is sold to two puppeteers, Frank Paris and T.E. Lewis. They set up a puppet theater and a workshop in the house. Now, if we're talking about liminal things and oddities, hard to get much weirder than puppets, I think.
Yeah. So first we have a supposed sculptor, and then puppeteers move in.
Yeah, so
a sculptor, a whore, and some puppeteers.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah. It's quite the heady mix. Yeah. And Walter Gibson.
Yeah.
So Paris describes the haunting events in the house, and he says there's an odor, a strong odor of violets he could smell sometimes. The sound of people, in his words, waltzing up and down the stairs at night. I don't think he meant they were literally dancing. I think he meant they were just traveling freely up and down the stairs. House guests had also heard these unknown footsteps. But perhaps most interesting is he reported the sighting of a male apparition in the house. It was described as a dark-haired man wearing dress clothes and an Inverness cape, which is a kind of dress cape.
Really only found on theatrical subjects, Jack the Ripper, and random paranormal facts.
And Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
It was seen at dusk. The witness, at least the witness we know about, was an older woman named Alice, who was friends with the puppeteers. She turned to tell them about the ghost, turned back, and it disappeared, in her words, like a puff of smoke, which is an interesting descriptor. given the way the shadow disappears often in these stories. The shadow, you'll be interested to know, he did have supernatural powers. He could cloud men's minds, but he also used stage magician tricks. He would disappear in puffs of smoke and all these different tricks at the time, because Gibson was so familiar with them. The shadow would use all these different tricks to confound his enemies.
So he didn't have any sort of superhero, like some sort of fantastic ability that was given to him by some adverse...
Well, he
wasn't bitten by a radioactive spider. He wasn't...
No, he didn't fall into a gamma ray vat or however the Hulk was made.
Or just... He wasn't rich.
He was. Well, his alter ego was. Sort of. It's very confusing. We went over it with John.
Okay.
But his powers were gotten through training. So he did have like supernatural powers, the ability to cloud
so
men's
there would
mind
be a
and so forth.
montage where he would be working out and training his mind.
In the movie?
Yeah, he would probably be sitting down with a deck of cards trying to memorize everything.
Probably.
And in the background, some very energetic 80s...
I should have watched so they did a Shadow movie with Alec Baldwin as the Shadow in the 90s. And I should have watched that and prepped for this, because I actually like that movie. I've seen it. I remember really liking it. And I haven't seen it in, I don't know, 20 years or more.
Yeah. It probably didn't hold up, I'm betting.
I'm guessing it probably didn't. But
So the 90s was like that return to a lot of those old classic sort of proto-comic book characters too. You know, like The Mask and like those
Rocketeer.
Rocketeer, yeah, like a lot of those.
So I just thought that was very interesting that she described it disappearing in a puff of smoke, knowing nothing about the author of The Shadow, how it lived there. A week later, Paris said he saw the same apparition. This time it was wearing a hat. He described the ghost, and this is a quote, "I saw the ghost myself, exactly as Alice had described him. Wearing evening clothes, a cape, a hat, his face somewhat obscured by the shadows of the hallway." So he was obscured by the shadows, this figure they saw, which is one of the reasons Gibson said he clad the shadow in black, is he wanted him to be able to blend in the shadows and have that hat so he could hide in the shadows and step out and make himself known when he wanted to.
Which kind of becomes like sort of like the detectives.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Like the noir kind of detectives go-to getup.
Yeah, absolutely. So Paris said his dog also noticed the spectral visitor and went up to the ghost as if to greet it.
Wow. And none of these people are aware that this is the house where... Was this the house he actually wrote the Shadow stories in?
Yes, this is when he would have been writing 2 novels a month, doing that kind of intense work.
Okay, I'm thinking of a word. It's very strange familiars. It starts with a T.
Yes.
Am I right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not Tim, by the way.
So, as we know of Holzer, he always brings one of his mediums with him to the house. His medium, and I have quotes around that in the outline here, and I'll say it again. Then went into a trance, and this medium determined the house was a gambling den filled with opium smokers.
Oh, okay.
The only thing interesting about that is the number of, like I said, sort of Chinese villains that would have been involved in the opium trade and so forth that the Shadow did face in the stories. This medium said a woman had been murdered in the house.
Always.
The crime was committed by a man named Ming.
Oh, that's not too racist.
A woman had been decapitated there, and her bones were still in the house.
Does anybody haunt a house where people lived pleasant lives and then just died of old age in their beds?
I think ghost hunting back then there was a lot of drama, and there was a lot of thinking people would never be able to prove or disprove this, right? That things have been lost to time. Now we can very much prove and disprove these things, at least get a lot closer than they could back then. And it's like, what were they doing? What is this goofy story she's coming up with? But I think back then they thought they were safe. Like, this stuff is lost to time. No one will ever figure this out.
And if something like this sort of dramatically happens, you feel like there must be a dramatic cause, you know? So a spirit doesn't come back to haunt an area that was not related to him in any sort.
So the other people that were there, they said, let's look for these bones. If there's bones in this house, let's look for them. And of course the medium was immediately overtaken. It was
just probably too much.
It was too much for her. She became too distressed and refused, and said that her feelings of tragedy about the house were already too intense. They couldn't possibly look for these bones. So none of the medium's assertions about the house have been proven to be true. People have looked into it since, like absolutely none of them. So Holzer, he's dead now, but back in time. Holzer back there, and you need new mediums. But what is interesting is Walter Gibson lived there, 12 Gay Street, during the time he was writing the Shadow novels, as I said.
Do any of these plots, though, that she came up with, are they part of the novels?
With over 200 Shadow novels?
Probably.
It possibly could be, yeah. So Gibson didn't report any strange phenomena happening in the house himself. Mm-hmm. But he did read Holzer's story later on. You know, I don't know how deep his knowledge... It sounds like he was pretty into the paranormal. And
I mean, if he was friends with Houdini, Houdini was one of the first people to really be an active collector of strange phenomenon and books about demonology and witchcraft and all that sorts of things. So I think anybody in that set was pretty heavy into it for the time period.
Right, yeah. So this is a quote from Gibson from the interview in the Duende fanzine. He said, 12 Gay Street, Hans Holzer says it's haunted. People see a man in evening clothes moving in and out. But that's where I wrote The Last Shadow. And what they're seeing is Lamont Cranston. They're seeing what we call an afterimage psychic projection, not a ghost.
So he brought him to life and then he still lived there.
In a sense. I mean, that's the idea. So I believe this is the word.
Oh, I actually have not seen these.
I know, but that is the word you were suggesting?
That was the word I was suggesting.
Yes, so the question is, were the inhabitants of Gibson's former residence seeing a tulpa created by Gibson? And for those not familiar, tulpa is a concept from Tibetan lore. John Keel wrote this in the Mothman Prophecies. He said, the Tibetans believe that advanced human minds can manipulate invisible energies into visible forms called tulpas, or thought projections. For someone writing that intensely about a character, is that enough to make, as he was calling them, these psychic afterimages where people were picking up on him?
Well, it's a huge emotional investment.
It really is.
To spend that much of your life writing about or as that person,
yeah.
To not have a little of it linger.
Yeah, to me that's way more interesting than a ghost.
Oh yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like
infinitely more interesting.
Mm-hmm. The fact that you could leave a little residue.
Yeah, really, really interesting. So speaking of the Mothman Prophecies, Keel also features a bit about the hauntings at 12 Gay Street. And this is a quote. There's an old house on a tree-lined street in New York's Greenwich Village, which harbors a strange ghost. It is dressed in a long black cape and wears a wide-brimmed hat pulled down over its eyes as it slinks from room to room. But wait, this ghost may not be a member of the Restless Dead at all. There were never any reports of hauntings there until about 20 years ago, after the house was vacated by a writer named Walter Gibson. And Keel goes on to describe Walter Gibson in The Shadow. Continuing, he says, why would a shadow-like apparition suddenly appear in an old house? Could it be some kind of residue from Walter Gibson's very powerful mind? So Keel's suggesting that this apparition may be a tulpa or something like a tulpa, which again, to me, is far more interesting than some
the
random
decapitated
ghost.
Woman who would somehow take the form of a man in that kind of costume.
The amount of work and energy, as we were saying, that Gibson invested in this character, combined with this liminal nature of the house, with the sculptor and the puppet theater being there, maybe this was like the ideal place for psychic phenomena to manifest.
Well, it's also a place of amazing creativity, too. I like that aspect of it. Like, the puppeteers are bringing inanimate things to life. He's bringing inanimate things to life, and...
Yeah, and the sculptor, too, is making things from, you're literally either building up things from whatever materials you're using, or you're taking away, if you're using a block of marble, for instance, you're taking away till you have something there. Yeah.
So in that way, it's sort of akin to like a nursery.
Yeah, very much so. If your puppy is greeting ghosts and walking up to them in your haunted townhouse in New York City, this may or may not be a problem. I don't know. For me, it'd be a bonus, but...
Yeah, it would be like a...
For other people, maybe that's a problem. Maybe you want them to stop greeting the ghosts.
Or maybe just on your command, if you say stop greeting ghosts, you'd want them to stop.
Exactly.
Paranormal puppy problems at 90 days to the perfect puppy.
Exactly. 90 Days to the Perfect Puppy can help you, whatever your problem is. You can find them at sithappens.us. Look for the 90 Days to the Perfect Puppy link at the top of the page. They have online sources. They've got video lessons. They've got a secret Facebook group, which you can join. I'm actually a member. I'm a puppy list member of the secret Facebook group, but I do enjoy seeing people put up their stories. And the thing that's cool about that is somebody might be having an issue that you're having as well, and they're talking about it, and they might have found a creative solution for it, or they might get the help that you're looking for from the 90 Days to the Perfect Puppy staff, and you can certainly apply that to your puppy, etc. So it's a really, really cool aspect of the 90 Days to the Perfect Puppy service. And of course, they have one-on-one options available as well. They have a relationship-based approach that helps you and your puppy become perfect for each other. They'll help you understand how your dog thinks and apply proactive training methods. They'll teach you what to do and perhaps more importantly, what not to do so you and your puppy, again, can become perfect for each other. Find them at sidhappens.us. Look for the 90 Days to the Perfect Puppy link at the top of the page. Now, there's some people online that have dug into this, ghost hunters and so forth, and they feel that Keel was either wrong or mistaken in his interpretation of the haunting.
But there's other precedents aren't there, for houses like that are haunted by characters?
Yes, there's a very famous one that David Weatherly told me about. I should look into it more. It's a plantation in the South that's supposedly haunted, and one of the people that supposedly haunts this plantation is a slave woman. And people see her, and there's a very specific description of her and so forth, and she has a name, and I don't know if she's spoken to people and said her name or whatever, but in any case, for years and years, everyone just believed this story, and then somebody did some historical research, and this person never existed. This slave woman never existed. So people have absolutely created, entities in a sense in the past, and people have, I think, even maybe photographed this ghost, in the past on the plantation. It's a complete fabrication. People have done that with psi experiments where they've just decided to come up with a ghost, and they name him and they give him a fake history and they try to contact him through various psychic means, and then they end up contacting him and he'll answer questions about his life, and so you can absolutely, well, I won't say you can, but I think people have absolutely created entities out of the aether. Now, how animated they are and how independent they are from our thoughts, I don't know, but
yeah. And at what point does that act of creation make it part of like the collective unconscious?
Yeah, exactly.
Did we perpetuate we, not just strange familiars, but we as our culture, are we perpetuating phenomenon because we actually can interact and hear about other people's experiences in a way that we didn't have access to before?
I mean, absolutely, I think so. And then you take something like The Shadow, which was so important to pop culture. In the interview with Jon, Sam, and I all talked about our fathers saying, just, would come out randomly and say, who knows what evil lurks in the heart of men? The Shadow knows.
Oh, yeah.
And that comes from the old Shadow radio show. And it made that much of an impression on all of our dads that they would just say that to it, like as kids.
Yeah, not only that, but your dad might have been just old enough, but their fathers are younger than that, and it's like
I think my dad actually did listen to the old radio show. So it's this culture idea that's passed down, and the Shadow, in a way, while he's a more obscure character now, he really did influence Batman and Moon Knight and all these other characters that have taken so much from. So in that way, he's just kind of grown through pop culture. So I think something like that's like,
he's the literal caped crusader.
Yeah, absolutely. And the shadow of all these other guys, he's in the background, but it's just pregnant with possibility to become a tulpa or something like it. I think even more so than Batman. I think because this character's kind of on the fringes of everything and inspired all that. He's kind of behind all that. And
he's devoid of the ego of, say, like Batman. I mean, Batman, he's imbued, probably with... I'm projecting a little bit here, but because of his sort of moneyed upbringing, he's imbued with this idea that basically he can do whatever he wants, right?
I mean, some people say that, yes. I mean, short answer, yes. Some people say that Batman is a problem superhero because of that, because he's
a child of immense privilege who just isn't dissuaded because he knows he can fall back on his money to special.
In any case, people online, like I said, these ghost hunter types have said that like Keel's made too much of this. He's got the wrong impression about this ghost. It's not the shadow. And he's making too much of this connection with the shadow. Or that he misinterpreted the Duende interview, which is not really possible because Mothman Prophecies is published before the Duende. Keel didn't read about this in Duende. Gibson sort of says that people were seeing Lamont Cranston, which is one of Shadow's multiple alter egos, not the Shadow. So people are saying, well, see, Keel made too much of it. People aren't seeing the Shadow. They were seeing Lamont Cranston. This is splitting hairs.
Yeah, they're seeing Walter Gibson's creation, regardless of whether it takes that form or maybe for someone else. Maybe someone sees the Shadow, and at the same time, someone else sees Walter Gibson.
Exactly. In fact, the one person who saw him, the man who lived there, said he was wearing a hat and a cape, and he was in the shadows.
So now, this is an aside, which will probably get us off of our appointed outline, but what did Walter Gibson look like? Was he one of those people who affected the characters that he wrote about? Like, did he wear the hat?
I'll show you what Walter Gibson looked like. Somewhere in here there's a photo of Walter Gibson. The short answer, there he is in his old age.
Oh, with a cat. That's adorable.
So by that age, no. I'm guessing when he was younger, he probably had an air of the mysterious on purpose.
Yeah.
If he hung out with all those magicians, those guys were definitely into
the theatrical aspect of it. Yeah,
absolutely. So to assert that, people were seeing Lamont Cranston, not the Shadow, to me is, like I said, it's splitting hairs. It's ridiculous. And the one person said the guy was in a hat and a cape. Who is that if not the Shadow, right? Keel had to have some kind of inside knowledge of this. I don't know if he knew Gibson. It's entirely possible he did. They were interested in the same things. Keel lived in New York for a time.
Oh, I didn't know that. And maybe there was like sort of a network of people involved in that. I'm sure in New York at the time, it would have been a small community. Everybody would have known each other.
Yeah, so it's quite possible he either knew Gibson directly or at least knew of the story, because he writes about it before the Duende interview. So Mothman Prophecies was published in 75, Duende in 76, Duende number 2. It's not crazy at all to think Keel would have talked to other paranormal investigators or been interested in this house, or possibly even talk to the witnesses at the Gay Street address himself. It's not outlandish thinking, Keel was a curious guy, and he would have been into probably all these things, including the Shadow, I'm guessing. So Gibson, in his description of the hauntings, when he talks about people saying, he might have been using Lamont Cranston and the Shadow interchangeably. Just because he says people saw Lamont Cranston doesn't mean...
He meant they weren't seeing the Shadow.
Exactly. Like, he might have been using them interchangeably.
I mean, would it matter to you if Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde were in the house? I would feel like it's two sides of the same coin, right?
Yeah. So if we remember the witness descriptions, like I said, the one entity disappeared like a puff of smoke. So the Shadow used stage magician's tricks. He disappeared in puffs of smoke. That'd be within his bag of tricks. And maybe the witness didn't literally see it disappear in a puff of smoke, but it's a really interesting choice of words given the character. The other witness specifically states the apparition was wearing a cape and a hat with the face obscured by shadows, and that sounds to me very much like any description of the Shadow from any radio play I've heard, from any comic I've read, from any Shadow story I've read. And
now when you get witness reports of, you've definitely heard more stories than I have of people, bedroom invaders, various things people see, and a lot of times people do talk about seeing shadow people. Are they wearing hats and capes? There is one that they describe as the Hat Man. Not so much with the cape, but he is wearing more like that Rene Magritte kind of bowler hat guy that's repeated in the paintings all the time. Like sometimes it's a bowler hat, but often they'll describe a hat like the Shadow's hat, like more of a fedora or a slouch hat like the Shadow wears. Oh, I've had nightmares with more of the bowler hat guy. Really? Yeah. In Shadows? Not in Shadows, just a guy in a bowler hat. I think that's a thing. Is it? I think it is. I would rather not know about that. So that's the story of the ghost of 12 Gay Street. There's not a lot of information on hauntings since then. Maybe they continue, maybe they don't. Yeah, and the house might not even have its footprint, for lack of a better term. The bones of the house may have been changed or something, but it's very interesting. Ghosts didn't appear until after the time that Gibson was writing the stories. There's no records of ghosts before then. And then other places he's lived, has the Shadow appeared, or is this the place where he wrote the bulk of... I believe this is, so rereading my notes there, it sounds like that was the last place he was staying when he was writing the Shadow. So I think the entire time he was writing the Shadow, he was writing a lot of the Shadow, and he would have been pouring
a lot into it. He did bring back the Shadow in the 60s, but I think he's referring to the last of the original novels and radio shows that he was writing then. So there we have the Shadow. He knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. A lot of people have been requesting it over time, like long before we ever did Spindrift. Somebody contacted me and said, you should do a show about the Shadow and the haunting. Didn't know that we'd find enough for a whole episode, but once we saw that Gibson had all those other paranormal interests, I thought, well, there's enough here then. I can't
believe you did a podcast called Strange.
It was pre-podcast. They were called radio shows back then.
He did a podcast called...
How amazing. Copies of that show must exist somewhere. And I'd love to hear.
Oh, they're probably on archive.org, I bet.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to dig in and see if I can find any, because that's amazing. The fact that he did a show called Strange is just, when I saw that, I just started laughing. Like, amazing.
It's nice to know too that there's been this continuum of people who've been interested in that. It's not just a internet era fascination.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here you've already checked off people from sort of every decade of ghost hunting and paranormal in the 1900s.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't forget, as you heard Jon and Sam and I talk about, we're giving away 2 graphic novels of the Shadow. If you want a chance to win one of those, tag us in a picture and Instagram, your best shadow picture. It can be your own shadow, it can be somebody else's shadow. Get creative, do whatever you want. We're going to pick our favorites, and we will send out
Shadow swag.
2 graphic novels, courtesy of Riverbend Comics, riverbendcomics.com, and Strange Familiars. Make sure to follow Strange Familiars and Riverbend Comics too as well when you send us those photos. We're looking forward to them. I think it's a really fun idea Jon came up with. Here's your bowler hat guy.
It's a little different though. It's a little bit more.
Yeah, it's a little I guess larger than a bowler hat. It's a fancy fella tipping his hat.
I think he's an actor.
I think you might be right. He's wearing a nice long coat, got a flower on it. This was pinned up somewhere. That's the other thing that makes me think it's got pinholes in the corner. That makes me think it was an actor too. So we have a cabinet card, and you said these photographers were known for taking pictures of actors and so forth?
Yeah, I think this one I've seen with other actors.
Other actors and so forth.
Back in the days when Ohio only had to go by an O and not an OH.
I know. I like that.
Yeah.
Bowling Green O. The photographer is Morrison from Main Street and Bowling Green. So it's a very fancy fellow. It could be a young Lamont Cranston.
It could. He has a watch fob and... Actually, can tell based on this little notation here where I bought it from originally.
Because you're obsessive. It's okay, I am too. You can find this photo in our Etsy shop. If you go to the show notes under this episode, you'll see a picture of this. You can click on that. It'll take you to our Etsy shop where you can buy this and some other photos of the week are remaining there. Past few have sold right away. So check this guy out. He's pretty neat.
Bit of a dandy.
I was going to ask if he qualified as the dandy.
I think he's a border dandy.
He's a borderline dandy?
Yep.
Check him out. I think he goes well with this episode. While you're at Etsy, make sure to check out our other options. Our store name is Lost Grave, one word, which you can type in and find us. But if you type in Strange Familiars, our stuff should pop up. We have copies of all of my books there right now, including the new book, Where the Footprints End, Volume 2. They are in stock, and they will ship right away if you order them now. No more waiting. But all my other books are up there, and Apparitions, Illustrations of the Other, my art book, the only place to get it is from us on Etsy or from Riverbend Comics. But check out everything else we have there at Etsy, including, hopefully, it's early in the week when we're recording this, but hopefully the artwork for this episode. I'm going to try to do a drawing of the Shadow and put it up there, so you might be able to purchase that if it's not going already.
Seems to be something that would be in your wheelhouse.
I do like the Shadow, and I've never drawn him before, so this will be a treat. Also on Etsy, Chad has a store now, Ruck Rabbit Outdoors. Our friends at Karmic Garden have a shop with all kinds of good-smelling stuff, natural soaps and so forth. They have the Flannel Man scent, and they have the Strange Familiar scent, the Bespoke Strange Familiar scent as well. Check them out while you're on Etsy. Coming up here, we'll be doing our Where the Footprints End Volume 2 interview, where Alison will be dragging Josh and I over the coals. And look for us all around podcast land. Josh and I are doing the virtual book tour now, so you'll probably see us pop. I'm off to writing my next book or two. We'll see how many it ends up being. doing artwork for other books. Excited about that. Well, you can always find us at strangefamiliars.com. Links to everything we do should be there. We'll also put links in the show notes as well. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be back soon with another episode of Strange Familiars. Strange Familiars is a production of Dark Holler Arts, music, books, art, podcasts, and more. Intro and background music is by Stone Breath. You can find more at stonebreath.bandcamp.com. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/strangefamiliars, where you can join the Strange Familiars gathering group, and we're on Instagram at Strange Familiars.
Inside my head, and I wept as fever burned, until I saw the bone white bird. Black Maria called it here, to calm my heart and ease my fear, and keep me hidden from their eyes. Soul is still and full of life. Lo, behold the bone white bird, answers to her holy word, and stands guard for hours still, blessed in its bone white quill. Black Maria is blessed too. She brings us bird so brave and true. Still I weep beneath its wing, and ever will the bird song ring. Fingers of the dead clawing from inside my head, and I wept as fever burned, until I saw the bone white bird.